my view. So I think it's important for us to, I know that people always have that question: how long was his involvement? Why did he stick around so long? Why didn't he fight more, like his friend Junger, who was building an army, to take this on? And Junger was a fighter. Heidegger, I don't think Heidegger ever really served like Junger did. Junger was in the trenches during a period, and he was very disillusioned right away. So what we're I think involved here is really looking at a conservative revolution in a way, conservative revolution, the other path. Even though it had many similarities and there were connections between the Bolshevik moment and its attitude towards the bourgeoisie, this is shared by Nietzsche, Marx, obviously Engels, all the way through Heidegger and the Heideggerian Marxists, and of course, in some ways, the National Socialists. In some ways, in the conservative revolution, were against middle class values and value formation that came out of the bourgeoisie. So again, I think we need to keep this in mind when we read him. In a sense that we have to follow the thought, and I think we're going to get much more out of it. Then the judgment would come. I think this is important. Anyway, I'm open to what other people think. Richard, I see you're unmuted. Again, part of the project here is to recapture, the Greek philosophy, as essentially as possible, right? And to make the modern German, that German in a real interior dialogue. So this is always where he goes, and this, of course, is a criticism of Derrida that he's Greco-Roman centric, in many ways. Yeah. So, but anyway.
I mean, yeah. In Appendix 4, Michael, he actually brings up National Socialism.
Yeah, he does.
Through this, the intellectual situation finds some clarification, while the laborious fabrications of such absurd offshoots such as the National Socialist philosophies produce nothing but confusion. And on the Wikipedia, someone also writes that this text was published in a sense to show Heidegger's inner resistance after the 1930s against the Nazi regime and National Socialism.
Okay. You know who wrote the Wikipedia
Sidoni Keller.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know.
Are you looking at the thing that began the position of Descartes?
Yeah, it's on page 140.
Yeah. Okay. I mean that's not a bad starting point, because he does capture, I think, the transition from medieval scholasticism to Cartesian certainty, and then the overcoming, right, of Cartesian, grounding of the new metaphysical project, the Universalis Thesis. So maybe we could start there today, and then maybe work backwards. If you turn to page 139, the fundamental metaphysical position, and this is very important because this is the beginning of modern subjectivity. Like it or not, the cogito is the self-certainty of the ego. It's the beginning of the egological region to the phenomenologist. Even in Freud, Lacan, if you will, the ego is born during this period. And of course, this is the I think, the cogito ergo sum, the I am, because I am thinking, right? So let's go over this kind of slowly for a second. The fundamental metaphysical position of Descartes is taken over historically from the Platonic Aristotelian metaphysics and its moves, despite its new beginning within the same question. So he tries to frame Descartes not as a radical shift, if you will, but still engaged in the same question, right? What is it to be, right? That this question, formulated in this way, does not come to the fore in his meditations, only proves how essentially the change in the answer to it already determines the fundamental position. Descartes' interpretation of what it is to be and of truth first creates the presupposition underlying the possibility of a theory of knowledge or a metaphysics of knowledge, right? First principles of an epistemology. Through Descartes, realism is first put in the position of having to prove the reality of the outer world. And I guess everybody knows that Descartes' project is, this radical pushing, hyperbolic pushing doubt to the point of where the only thing that is left is, I am this thing that thinks, right? This is the only certainty I have, right? And this is going on both in the fourth book of the Discourse on the Method, and of course in the Meditations on First Philosophy, both in the first meditation and the second meditation. So anyway, of having to save that which is as such. So the essential modifications of the fundamental position of Descartes that have been attained in German thinking, and again, the emphasis is German thinking, since Leibniz, do not in any way overcome that fundamental position itself. They simply expand its metaphysical scope and create the presuppositions of the 19th century, still the most obscure of all the centuries of the modern age up to now. Indirectly, these modifications confirm the fundamental position of Descartes in a form in which they themselves are almost unrecognizable, though they are not, for that reason, the less real. In contrast, mere Cartesian scholasticism with its rationalism has lost all power further to shape modern times. With Descartes begins the completion and the consummation of Western metaphysics. And yet, because such a consummation is only possible once again as metaphysics, modern thinking has its own greatness. Okay? So again, Descartes is this new orientation, right? That is basing everything on this new fundamental metaphysics in terms of two regions are really discovered by Descartes. The I think, the ego, if you will, consciousness, probably better put, is discovered by, one becomes conscious of one's thinking as a thinking thing. And then secondly, the object world outside and how we constitute this. So the res cogiton, the thinking thing, and the res extensa are completely reformulated in this moment that sets up the modern philosophy that is reworked. And I think when he mentions 19th century, he's really looking at, of course, Fichte and then Hegel, in terms of, this, the consciousness and self-consciousness section of the phenomenology, as well as Fichte's, kind of absolute subjectivity, which is a precursor to Hegel's work. All right, let me go on for a second because he uses these terms again with the Greeks. With the interpretation of man as sub ictum, Descartes creates the metaphysical presupposition for future anthropology of every kind and tendency. In the rise of the anthropologies, Descartes celebrates his greatest triumph. Through anthropology, the transition of metaphysics into the event of the simple stopping and setting aside of all philosophy is introduced. The fact that Dilthey disavowed metaphysics, that fundamentally he no longer even understood its question and stood helpless before metaphysical logic, is the inner consequence of his fundamental anthropological position. And if you read this section, and I'll refer you also, we can go back to page 133, 134, which is very important on anthropology as a humanism. He's going to go back there and he's going to really work against, anthropology. So let me go on, right? His philosophy of philosophy is an outstanding form of the anthropological abrogation, not the overcoming of philosophy. This is why every anthropology in which previous philosophy is employed at will, but is explained as superfluous qua philosophy, has the advantage of seeing clearly what is required along with the affirmation of anthropology. Through this, the intellectual situation finds some clarification, while the laborious fabrications of such absurd offshoots as the National Socialist philosophies, and here he goes, and as Josh pointed out, this is 1938. We're 5 years since the quote election, right? But, 4 years into the, the propaganda, the triumph of the will, if you will, to use Leni Riefenstahl's film title, right? Nothing but confusion. So again, you can see this antagonism building against those that parade or those that consider themselves philosophers of the National Socialist kind, right? Nothing but confusion. The worldview does indeed need and use philosophical erudition, but it requires no philosophy since as worldview, and this is very important on Weltanschauung, because a lot of people think you're doing a philosophy when you do a worldview, but you can also talk not only the age of the world picture, but the psychology of the worldviews leads us to this, confusion, really, in a way. Yeah, because there's no philosophy needed. It has already taken over a particular interpretation since his worldview is, and structuring of whatever is. But one thing surely anthropology cannot do. It cannot overcome Descartes, nor even rise up against him. For how shall the consequence ever attack the ground on which it stands? So Descartes is the result of Western thinking up to that point. He is both the consequence and the ground on which it stands. This is very, very important, again, that I was mentioning that the three, in Heideggerian terms, the history of being is read, being as the one in ancient philosophy, being as natura in the Greco-Roman erudition through medieval scholasticism, feudal society, if you want to employ that language. And then thirdly, the era that we're still in many ways, self-consciousness, right? The self-consciousness. So this is very, very important to keep in mind. Descartes can only be overcome through the overcoming of that which he himself founded. We have to enter into that, right? Only through the overcoming of modern, and that means at the same time, Western metaphysics, right? Overcoming means here, however, the primal asking, and again, this is a return to being in time or being as time, asking the question concerning the meaning, that is, concerning the realm of the projection or delineation, and thus concerning the truth of being, which question simultaneously unveils itself as the question concerning the being of truth. So this is very, very important for this section. I'm glad Josh mentioned this, Appendix 4. I'm going to go back to this anthropology because I'd like us to look at this in terms of something we're very much subjected to, I just want to read number 5 too, because I think this is important as well. Number 5 of the appendix, page 141. The concept of world, of Welt, right, as it is developed in being and time, is to be understood only from within the horizon of the question concerning openness for being. You need the openness for being to really have world and worlding in Heidegger, right? A question that, for its part, remains closely conjoined with the fundamental question concerning the meaning of being, not the meaning of that which is only. So this is, again, an attempt to go against the essentializing tendency. Very much so, right? Very much so. Okay. The fundamental question of the meaning of being is this openness, right? World and worlding happening. All right, let me just go back for a second, then I'll open it up to you in a way. I want to just go back to the anthropological for a second, just because I think this is very important. Yeah, these several pages, and then we can go through the text even more carefully. Let's see how much I really should read. He's building the picture theory of the world and the picture character of the world, and we can go back to that. But let me start this. The two events, right? He already is and remains subject for its positive struggle against individualism and the community as the sphere of goals that govern all achievement and usefulness having any meaning. So on page 133, the interweaving of these two events, which for the modern age is decisive, that the world is transformed into picture and man into subjectum, or subjectium, throws light at the same time on the grounding event of modern history, an event which at first glance seems almost absurd. Okay? Namely, the more extensively and the more effectively the world stands at man's disposal is conquered. We're on page 133 of the text, Kristen. Yeah. So it's conquered. The more objectively the object appears. And this is very interesting how objectivity is born, how it dominates in so many ways. Very, very important. This is a critique of scientism, right? Yeah. And also a critique of science that does not reflect on itself. And all the more subjectively, i.e. the more importunately, does the subjectium rise up, and all the more impetuously to observation of and teaching about the world, change into a doctrine about man. This is very important, the doctrine of man, right? Very, very interesting. And I refer some people, look, I know I make a lot of cross references, but I think this is important. If you go back to the introduction to metaphysics and his reading of that section on man, it's very important. You see this at work, the strangeness, of man, the alienation, but at the same time, the mastery and the domination. In some ways, he is interpreting that ode as a birth of, the Greek notion of anthropos, right? To speak of this very differently. Josh, you wanted to say something, or yeah?
No, that's
okay.
nice.
Okay. All right. Let me just go on with this paragraph, and then we'll chat for him. Yeah. So anyway, it is no wonder that humanism, and this is the humanist thing, and unfortunately, my friend Bruno Gulli's not here tonight, and we can really go to town on the humanist, anti-humanist controversy. But anyway, first arises when the world becomes picture. Very important, when the world becomes picture, right? So it would have been just as impossible for humanism to have gained currency in the great age of the Greeks, as it would have been impossible to have had anything like a world picture in that age. Impossible. Humanism, therefore, in the more strict historiographical sense, is nothing but, and this is very interesting, this is very Nietzschean, is nothing more than a moral, aesthetic anthropology, in a way. You can hear echoes of the genealogy of morality here, of morals throughout. You can also hear this attack, again, on bourgeois morality. How did this come to be? Et cetera, et cetera. There's a class position in here. You can start looking at it very actively. The name anthropology, as used here, does not mean just some investigation by man, by a natural science, right? Nor does it mean the doctrine established within Christian theology of man created, fallen, and redeemed. It designates, on the other hand, the philosophical interpretation of man, which explains and evaluates whatever is in its entirety from the standpoint of man and in relation to man. This becomes an ongoing antagonism of Heidegger, anthropology, philosophical anthropology, from this moment on till his death, till 1976. So we're talking about the last 40 years of his philosophical activity and thinking. Anthropology and philosophical anthropology become an antagonism versus philosophy. Richard, yes, yeah.
I was just I paid a little more attention to the Greek this time.
Good.
The few Greek words he uses, and what I found a nice shorthand, or it's interesting that he says here, the more importunately does the subjectum rise up, and subjectum and hupokaimenon, the Greek, and they both share this preposition of under, right. Sub and hupo. And here he says, does the subjectum rise up? Right. It's like, and putting these two words in connection to each other, for me, helped me to understand, as I was looking through it, was this sense as the ground, or the condition, the underlying condition, the hupokaimenon in Aristotle, which I was just glancing at in Little and Scott, so that as if the becomes somehow ascendant in a way. It wasn't. It's not that it wasn't there in the ancient world. He says, for example, later he uses the term eidos, right? The whole kind of visual bias of Greek thought, versus, for example, Judaic thought, which is much more about listening.
Yes.
The voice of God. For the Greeks, it's very much about the visual. So it's there in the Greek, but this subject, which is kind of in the sense of underlying in some way, that which is there when you take away all predicates remains the subject.
Yes.
You take everything away, and it sort of it's what remains. Right. Has now taken on, a different kind of autonomy. So that to me was a very, helpful little shorthand. What was his putting together the Greek and the Latin? I kind of understood something there in a shorthand way that I hadn't before.
Right. No, very good point. And I think what you're hinting at is that this is something that kind of induces, if you will, this transformation from the hypochemy and the underlying, strata, if you will, or the underlying movement that becomes the Latinate, the subject, right? That becomes the domination of the subject over the object in many ways.
Yes.
And he's kind of presupposing this, and this is the birth of anthropology in many ways.
Yeah.
This is another confrontation he's doing. So yeah, and we begin to see this in philosophy. And I like this notion of stripping away all the predicates. You're left with the sujet, right? The predicate is the sujet. And of course, eidos in Plato that you mentioned, the history of the I. I mean, basically, Platonic philosophy is the beginning of the I as dominant in Western philosophy, in the Platonic ideal. Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
No, I just going to say another thing that I was just so struck is that, he talks about all this, and I wait for him to talk about photography or cinema, the image in the modern world, technology, this relation, and he goes to painting.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting avoidance, or, you'd think, well, 19th century, this is the age of the birth of photography, the birth of cinema. And you think it's interesting in terms of, because the Greeks really don't talk, for all their focus on thought as being ocular centric, as it's been said. Yes. Nevertheless, don't really have a large kind of elaboration of the visual image, the painted image or anything. There's some, but there's not a lot. Right. And I was kind of waiting for him to talk about, the natural, that in modern times, the technology of the image kind of explodes or goes into overdrive, but he stays away from it, which I found striking.
Right. Well, he doesn't mention, there's never any kind of empirical examples, as you say, from cinema, although his favorite for him was Kurosawa's Russia because of interpretations. He likes the 4 different levels of the actual situation in the film, those different levels that are told in terms of the narrative. He likes that very much as an example of hermeneutics. Kurosawa's Russia is one of his examples there in terms of this. I mean, this is something that obviously Stiegler will take up, cinematic time, and of course Kittler in terms of the media and optical fiber. But again, I think you're really on to something. When Lyotard did his little intervention on Heidegger, he wrote Heidegger and the Jews, right? And he did point out, the Judaic part of this is that very close to Heidegger in a way, that Heidegger could be the new Jew in Greece, right? the new Greece and its Jew, because of this dialogue going back to the Greek in terms of the hearing, right? again, once again. And of course, we have many, directions on this. We have the Martin Bernals who talk about Black Athena, right? And the Indo-European languages, and, how the Greek vocabulary was much more Semitic than it originally, we had thought. So, again, there are many tendencies within this premise. But yes, I mean, Heidegger was called, the new level was the new Greece, right? With a quote failure if after World War II, and in some ways of, say, the Bolshevik promise, right? That the new Greece, the new Polos, was to be predicated on the Heideggerian reading of ancient Greek, right? And bringing it up to the modern times to understand this. I don't know how other people feel about this. I mean, I find this so full with, many levels. There's so many layers to this thinking that it's very stimulating. At the same time, can you take a political moment? Because for Heidegger, the polos is really, again, the place of polemics, right? The struggle itself, right? This is what's going on the polemos is the origin of the polos, right? That kind of struggle. So he's going to go back there as well and talk about this. War is the father of all things, as we know, or polemos is the father of all things. Heidegger makes a lot out of this in the introduction to metaphysics, the Heraclitean, Heraclitus' statement that war is the father of all things, or better put, polemos is the father of all things. And this is, in a sense, I mean, I'll just make this comment. This is brief and, kind of glib in some ways, but I think it's very important to keep in mind, what are academics in these universities most afraid of today in terms of all these meetings, all this nonsense going on, et cetera, et cetera? They're really afraid of engaging in polemics. It's kind of amazing how the struggle, people just back off. This is very, very interesting how this works. We're going to agree to disagree. That's not polemos, right? Right. This is the worst of liberal civil society in so many ways. This will get you a Democratic defeat in Virginia, right? In Virginia, right? Anyway, I think this is very, again, important to understand that there is a politics here, right? I mean, and Josh, by going to this about him, in National Socialist philosophy, he's just dismissing, this is junk. He's right. I mean, but he's still the thinker of a German tradition, right? This is not, the continuation just of Marx, right? Or a revisiting or a historical encounter, if you will, even though he considers Marx the last humanist, which is interesting in the letter on humanism, the highest level of humanism. Yeah. So this is interesting. We could talk about this later, when we get more into the technology and how Marxists may see it versus that of Heidegger. Yeah, Josh, you wanted to say something? Yeah.
Oh, I think David wanted to say something, but I was wondering. I just wanted to see if I got this right on his sort of truck with anthropology.
Yeah.
As I saw it, it's sort of connected to this idea of research and busyness that
Yes.
sort of from the beginning.
Absolutely.
So instead of asking this sort of fundamental philosophical questions, again, sort of metaphysical questions of what it is to be or what is being, it sort of displaces those philosophical questions with sort of, kind of an academic in some ways, or a sort of busyness of anthropology, a new domain of research rather than like getting to I don't know, those larger questions, those gigantic questions of philosophy, I guess. And I don't know, does that make sense?
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah. He's really trying to bring, look, you cannot overcome metaphysics unless you work through it.
Right.
And anthropology is not working through metaphysics. It's
Right.
not working through first principles. And in a way, he is speaking to kind of, what you just mentioned, a kind of drive for careerism, the drive, towards, certain aspects of the worst of the academic life. And he's taking on a long tradition, because the Neo-Kantian tradition, there are historical moments here, and Delphi and others that are very prominent in 19th century German thinking. Remember, he's in a battle of the conflict of the faculties, if you will. They are still privileging this anthropomorphic, centric view of investigation and relationship to natural science in particular. And you can ask, how is the social sciences constructed? How is sociology, psychology, all of these disciplines? He's looking at this. And this is why, again, to me, the important part of Heidegger for our purposes today would be to reread this drive for fundamental ontology, how the disciplines are all thrown into question, right, by fundamental ontology. What are the being of these disciplines? What are these little branches, of knowledge that are going on that have taken over as disciplines, right, in so many ways? Yeah. I mean, philosophy is the last thing kids have to do, except at the Jesuit schools. I think in the city of New York, yes, yeah, except in the city of New York, I think St. John's and Fordham are the only ones that require 3 semesters of philosophy. It's not Columbia or NYU, and certainly not LIU. And at Brooklyn College, I think has two requirements, in the CUNY system. But anyway, it's pretty amazing. And why is it suppressed? In a sense, because you get to think through representation and world picture and worldview, and how this is really part of a very, a 16th century, 17th century epistemological subject, that is still the subject dominating the object, right? It sets up so much, right, in a sense. So we live in this era where we see it around us, this domination of nature, the domination, of everything out there, obviously this kind of forced financialization, which is another kind of domination, I think, that Lazzarato and others hint at. I don't think they've elaborated much. Now our mayor wants us to go to be paid in cryptocurrency. I mean, this is the new thing in New York City. Eric Adams has mentioned, payment in cryptocurrency. The left is all happy because Cuba is going to accept cryptocurrency because it's going to displace the dollar. And I mean, if you believe that, you believe in the Truth Fairy and the, the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain. But anyway, I think this is, again, a kind of, tendency that we have, right, in some ways. So this is a very serious thinker, like him or not. He's a bastard. He kicks his mentor Husserl out of the door, closes him at the university. This was not a nice man. He was not a civil, person. I mean, there are many, there are biographies, there are a lot of nastiness that went on. But at the same time, you're in the presence of, I think, some of the most originary thinking that is going on, right? And certainly the thinker of time for our times, right? And again, yeah. So the fundamental ontology, going back to where Josh was, very, very important in being in time, how the disciplines are made, how they're constituted, and what the stakes are, in philosophical anthropology or the anthropological. David, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. I didn't mean to, cut off your question. I know you were before Josh. Yeah, go ahead.
That's all right. I was just trying to unpack this moment between the Cartesian moment and what he's trying to describe. It's what we're unpacking already. What he's trying to describe as like the moment of the emergence of the world picture as like the essence of the modern age, and how how Descartes and Cartesianism sort of become part or like a language of that moment or something like that. Well, like we're talking about or talking around a little bit. What I think is like the main point is that insofar as the world picture emerges, both like the world becomes instrumentalized by people and people become instrumentalized by the world, like sort of at the same time. So the way that he talks about the subjectum is on 131, right? The man is the one who is looked upon by that which is, right? So at the same time that like a conception of the world that can be totalizable for like humans, like we become totalizable to the world as well. So anthropology is a problem because it makes it approaches people so instrumentally, right? Which is the problem again with the entire research program that he goes through, is that instead of the world sort of unfolding to us or whatever, we are made to sort of create the picture of the world as we're being created, as folks create the picture of the world. And so there's no philosophy being done there. There's no real thought being done there. So the political intervention is at that level. So like there's no, he has no regard for party politics because the politics aren't at the level of party politics. This is already way off base if you're concerned with parties.
Party politics is just a little form of representational thinking.
Exactly. Like so the
exactly. You get this in the morning, I mean, why Hegel kind of, I think tongue in cheek said reading the morning newspaper is the morning prayer. We forgot to add the morning comedy. And my I'll play on Marx there instead of the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. But anyway, I mean, to those that are attuned, if you will, to this whole distinction that Heidegger is making, I'm glad you brought this up, because what's really being distinguished from is here apprehending, actual learning, and et cetera. Represent, to bring up what is present in hand. This is page 131, before oneself. Before oneself. So you're already in that framework. You're actually building that frame before oneself. And Josh also mentioned last week, and I couldn't find my copy. People that stayed here took some of my books and put it different places. But anyway, I'll find it. I was looking for what is called, what is it called? The thing, right? What is the thing? But I mean, anyway, in a way, Heidegger has this very interesting analysis of the thing as an object, right? But a thing also as standing outside, the Gegenstand that stands outside of us. And this is, again, how we begin to constitute the object world, right? So he really understands that. I think he has an extremely deep reading of Descartes here, extremely deep reading of Descartes on the, the things in the mind, the things outside, and this interplay between subject, object, and different levels, not only of objectivity, but also that the objects, we stand against it, right? The Gegenstand, right? That leads to things. So let me just finish. So before oneself is something standing over against, related to oneself, to the one representing it, and to force it back into this relationship to oneself as the normative realm. Exactly what you were just describing in your words, David. He puts, here in his, ponderous German, but it's pretty good at times, right? Anyway, whenever this happens, man gets into the picture, right? Gets into the picture in precedence over whatever is, right? This insertion. And again, you can go back and read this beautiful, ode that he comments upon in the introduction to metaphysics. The, what is man? What is anthropos? Right? In a sense. But in that, man puts himself in the picture in this way. He puts himself into the scene. How many times do we talk about that? What's on the scene? Think about this in terms of, the language we use. A sphere of that which is generally and publicly represented. Therewith, man sets himself up as the setting in which whatever is must henceforth set itself forth, must present itself. To be picture. You must picture it. Right? It's very interesting the way he elaborates. This is listen, rereading this was a real pleasure to me to watch this thought unfold in so many. Man becomes the representative of that which is, right? In the sense of that which has the character of object, right? But the newness in the events by no means consists in the fact that now the position of man in the midst of what is an entirely different one in contrast to that of medieval and ancient man. What is decisive is that man himself expressly takes up this position as one constituted by himself. The Cartesian subjectivity, the birth of self-consciousness, if you will, or consciousness, right? That he intentionally maintains it as that taken up by himself, and that he makes it secure as the solid footing for a possible development of humanity. This is our metaphysical age, really in a way, in some senses, if I had all the time in the world, I'd go back and study, probability and certainty theories in the 17th century. The calculative rationality that is put forward plays out every day in our lives today. You see it in the speech of people. You see it in the world of the culture industry apparatus. All of these things are really happening. Now, for the first time, is there anything such thing as a position of man? Right? Man makes depend upon himself the way in which he must take his stand in relation to whatever is as the objective. You know, you're not being objective. How many times do you hear that, right? In a sense, in the institutions, the way they frame things, etc. There begins that way of being human, which mans the realm of human capability as a domain given over. And this is very important because he's taking this from Protagoras, from the, man is the measure of all things, from the, the work of, the ancient Greeks, for measuring and executing for the purpose of gaining mastery over that which is as a whole. The age that is determined from out of this event is, when viewed in retrospect, not only a new one in contrast with the one that is past, but it settles itself firmly in place expressly as the new. To be new is peculiar to the world that has become picture. When accordingly, the picture character of the world is made clear as the representative of that which is, then in order fully to grasp the modern essence of representativeness, we must track out and expose the original naming power of the worn out word and concept to represent, Vorstellung, right, to set out before oneself and to set forth in relation to oneself. Through this, right, whatever it comes to stand as as object, and in that way alone receives the real or the seal of being, that the world becomes picture as one and the same event, and this is going back to where Richard started, 20 minutes ago, becomes picture as one and the same event with the event of man's becoming subjectum to the midst of that which is. And he'll go, again, these references to the propositions of the appendix. Only because and insofar as man actually and essentially has become subject, is it necessary for him, right, as a consequence, to confront the explicit question. It is an I confined to its own preferences and freed into its own arbitrary choosing, or as the we of society. Is it as an individual or as a community? Is it as a personality within the community or a mere group member in the corporate body? Is it a state, a nation, or as a people, or as the common humanity of modern man, that man will and ought to be the subject that in the modern essence he really is? So he's asking these questions. I'm really glad Josh began with this thing about National Socialism. He's asking these questions of the nation state, of where they are politically in some ways. I mean, this is very coded too, politically, to my mind at least, to read it.
Michael.
Yeah.
If I could just say very quickly, it strikes me, these paragraphs, I've read them a couple of times now in the last week.
Yeah, sure.
And it strikes me every time so my concern, my study, it's top of mind for me, right, is Stratcom and like public relations and stuff like that, right. Sort of primarily. And right. The way that Heidegger here is describing the sort of loop with which humanity sort of conceives of itself and addresses itself, and the sort of bottomlessness of the feeling that I get from the description is, to me, like the way that I conceive of strategic communication as kind of like a modern industrial, not just language, but approach to knowledge and approach to like the relationship between the I and the we, and who gets to communicate and who conceives the object of communication and the form of communication for the object. And in a world where in a world picture, right, where strategic communication forms kind of the hegemonic foundation for all communications, right? Where is the bottom where like people are just looking at the world and not looking at the last strategic communication that they were either a part of or trying to produce? And so it feels to me that like this is what Heidegger's grasping, both like in our relationship to the state, to the way that we see ourselves through sort of the conception of the world around us that we're capable of tapping into because of the way the modern state is kind of growing up, and the way that information and communication, like for people, from people, to people, all then begins to spiral around like what I need to get out of this communication from the object that I'm communicating with, which I can now perceive in this like vast kind of way, right? How do I want a massive number of people to respond to me? How do I want one person to respond to me? Constantly, I'm the object of these strategies, and constantly I am forming these strategies. So in that like relationship, which I feel like Heidegger is nailing in these paragraphs, right? Like you can see the formation of like how we are produced as humans within this kind of spiral of information and communication and understanding. And so it strikes me every time that I read it that he's talking about like the emergence of what we live in now as a fully enveloped net of strategic communication, where there's like, it's stratcom all the way down. You know what I mean? Like there's no ground. We wouldn't know, to his point, we wouldn't know how to articulate a ground other than this at this point. Like we can only struggle with the notion that maybe we have no capacity to picture this any other way. And at the moment, that's the best we can do.
No, you've raised very good points. I mean, again, this is a subversion of exactly what you're talking about. He really is trying to subvert this. And in some ways, the interesting thing about Heidegger is, in later, like, he talks about the dominance of cybernetics, right? And the cybernetics itself and communication. And this is what part of the argument always was against Habermas and communicative action. There is no such thing as an ideal speech act. There is no such thing as these strategies that you're really talking about, which is really grounded in this kind of thinking. It is strategic communication, as you said. And, there are a lot of people that, studied this, obviously, going forward. One of the best examples of this kind of study was Jean-Pierre Fayet's on totalitarian languages, a Marxist. I don't think any of it's been translated, but it's in French, and how this works in language and what the codes are. So there was a lot of work on that. And Ferruccio, oh God, what's his last? I think Della Landa on the labor ontology of language. He talks about language and work. Very interesting book. It's been out of print forever, of course, because it's dangerous, right? It's like, another guy that wrote The Great Training Robbery on all the training programs of the 70s and how they robbed everybody of their soul, right? In order to give them jobs, going through all these government programs. But yeah, I mean, these are great points, because again, what the stake is here is that he's really trying to get us outside of representational thinking, right? Ensnared by this representational thinking that has a very long tradition, in philosophy, etc. He's speaking to this. So in some ways, Descartes is both the friend and the enemy in one. It's a both and movement, right? We're learning from Descartes, but at the same time, how is this taken up, this dominance over the object, right, etc. And where do we go? So yeah, I'm very interested in what kind of work you're going to get out of this, because the police codes are very, very, very important. And Kristen has this idea. We talked about cop consciousness, right? And how active that is, right? And how that needs to really be elaborated. Not only the little cop in our head, but also the externalization of this kind of consciousness and how it plays out in everyday life. I mean, you go to academic meetings, you feel like you're a 2-year-old listening to these idiots these days.
If I can say very quickly, Michael, just on that, since you and Kristen are talking about this already, I'm working on my proposal for my dissertation right now, and one of the concepts I'm trying to work with is policing class culture, like in the way that Stanley talks about class and class formations. Class is as class does, not like exactly what you're trying to conceive of as well. I think the way that not just uniformed cops, but policing as a practice and set of conception of the world and experience of being in the world is connected to maybe uniform cops, but is a broader culture that sometimes moves in formation and acts in the world like in a concerted kind of interest. So yeah, I'm working on something very similar. Great.
Yeah, you may know this book already, but a great book on this notion is The Policing of Families, Jacques Danzolat. A great book on all of this stuff we're talking about, and how this works in the social field, right? Yeah. People don't recognize the Democrats are not really that much different than the Republicans in that they, instead of going out there and drilling drill baby drill, which some of them do, they go in and they create programs like HUD, right? They HEOP, right? All these kind of programs, which again become nothing but policing of families and ultimately new money makers. And this is why the conservatives get up in arms, or the Republican right gets up in arms in Congress. Oh, here they're going to create a new money maker for the Clintons or for the, whoever, et cetera. So this is, it's an interesting moment, right? That always is happening here in this policing and pop consciousness. And look, again, Heidegger, again, I don't want to defend, again, I'm not trying to defend the person or the actions. I'm really trying to engage the thought. I want to make that, at least clear from my end. But I think this is very subversive, right? He is really taking on, dominant, not only dominant representational thinking, but also, I mean, in a way, the state. He's very well aware of what's going down with Rosenberg on Nietzsche, Baumler on Nietzsche. These are the Nazi philosophers. They attended his classes. He was watched very carefully. So you have to read this in terms of what is really happening too in that imminent moment when he's presenting these things. This is 1938. This is not. This is before the invasion. I think right around the time of Poland and Czechoslovakia. It's the springtime for Hitler, a little bit earlier. I'm sorry, that's a popular culture reference. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I again, and the important thing is here is that he sees in some ways the anthropology again not only as an enemy but something that has restricted thought. It's not thinking. When he says we have not yet begun to think in what is called thinking, this is what he's talking about. We haven't begun to think yet. Yeah? And in a way, again, he writes a great essay later on, and I know I'm throwing around a lot of Heidegger, but it's interesting. The end of metaphysics, or the end of philosophy, and the task of thinking. And thinking becomes task-oriented. Within this, breaking this representational thing, representational, a kind of moment here, this kind of re-anthropolization that we have all the time. Identity politics is one of the great examples of this, one of the great examples of this. Yeah. The policing of everything too. The whole.
I want to ask a question.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I saw you.
No, it's okay. No, I want to ask a question. I mean, going back into the text in terms of Dilthey.
Sure.
And anthropology, because I mean, I've always read Heidegger in terms of incorporating a lot of what Dilthey was saying. And I think that he was a little unfair in terms of identifying Dilthey with anthropology. I mean, you can say that into it. I mean, in the sense that Dilthey's notion of hermeneutic essentially relativizes a thing in terms of one's own subjective position.
Right.
But Heidegger builds off of Dilthey in terms of reframing the issue so that it no longer has a level of, and this is a bad expression to use, of hyper-rationality, but he's trying to get at something that's going on underneath that essentially German philosophy has lost sight of. And you find that in the choice of the words he uses. Reflection is besinnen, it's not reflektieren.
Right.
The notion of image, it's not vorstellen.
Right.
He's struggling here to try to get at something at a different level of being that essentially German philosophy has lost sight of because it is too rational, is too Hegelian in expression. And
the Kantian.
That's his and Kant. That I think is what he's trying to do.
Right.
I'm not sure that I agree, but I think
I understand. Yeah.
I mean, that's because Dilthey is really, he revives Hegel to a certain extent, but he goes beyond it. He actually goes back to Kant in terms of the notion of reflective judgment. And there's a whole discussion that has gone on in philosophy about this. But
Yes, absolutely.
so.
Yeah, no, very good points. But I just add that the hermeneutic that Heidegger actually takes up to, of course, is Schleiermacher. You know,
Well, that's where Dilthey comes out of.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he wants to radicalize that hermeneutic, you know.
Yeah.
And again, I want us to be aware Heidegger is Greek as can be, right? I mean, he's not, you know, he's not going to stay only in the, you know, moment with his colleagues, etc. He wants this dialogue with the ancient Greek. You know, you have to remember this is someone studying Aristotle as early as 1923, 24, right? It's the concept of time when he's, you know, in his, you know, late 20s, early 30s. You know, he's doing all these histories of, you know, the history of philosophy in a certain way. But the main emphasis is about Aristotle, Tito and Onta, you know, you know, and this is a
his 22 lecture on Aristotle. You know, I looked at it today, and yeah. He was,
again. So I mean, Dilthey is obviously bringing him up, trying to ground the new sciences, right? Especially the human sciences, as the French say. You know,
well, the hermeneutic is essentially you no longer have an empty subjectivity,
right?
And you essentially you're very aware of the way in which you are influencing the way you understand the past. And so there's this subject-object dialectic that's there and it's almost like what he's doing is taking this kind of German idealist subject-object relationship, but re-thematizing it in a way which is getting to a kind of a lower level of rationality, a different rationality.
Well, I don't think he has a concept of reason. That's something Heidegger doesn't go to. He hardly ever mentions the word reason. In that case,
a different concept of rationality.
Maybe a different, but he never uses the word rationalitat or anything that kind of even speaks of, if you will, of rationality. You know, he's not about a thinker of, in this way, the text of Lukács written in the 40s, The Destruction of Reason, is right on. You know, in a way, it's a phenomenological destruction of reason that is at stake. You know, Lukács is trying to defend the Hegelian Marxist reason that he comes out of against Heidegger and Nietzsche in different ways. You know, I don't know if you've read that book, but
I've avoided it.
I mean, but again, listen, I mean, part of the methodology is we know. Go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry.
I mean, just to kind of go back to what you guys were talking about in the text on 131, actually, right before the section that we read, he talks about the Greek kind of conception of being or man in the world. I think it starts where it says, where it's like, so after this, that which is, that's right at the top, that which is that which arises and opens itself, which as the presence is, comes upon man as the one who presence is. In other terms, comes upon the one who himself opens himself to what presence is, and that he apprehends it. That which is does not come into being at all through the fact that man first looks upon it in the sense of a representing that has the character of a subjective perception. Rather, man is the one who is looked upon by that which is. He is the one who is in company with itself, gathered toward presencing by that which opens itself. To be beheld by what is, to be included and maintained within its openness, and in that way to be borne along by it, to be driven about by its oppositions and marked by its discord, that is the essence of man in the great age of the Greeks. So exactly what
and to go one more sentence, going back to what Richard brought up last week about Godard, Greek man is as the one who apprehends, right, that which is. And this is why in the age of the Greeks, the world cannot become picture. And then he goes on, about Greek man must gather and save, catch up and preserve, right? This is very interesting here. You know, instead of sheltering, right, we're preserving something, right? That we talked about last time. Yeah, in a way. There's no shelter, to play on Dylan, there's no shelter from the storm in Heidegger, right? There may be a preserving and a saving, but yeah, anyway, and you know, the German word for redemption, and when we get to Benjamin, we can talk about this, is solenta phenomena, saving the phenomena, redeeming the phenomena. This is what redemption really means. And of course, as we know in the Judaic tradition, the post, you know, the Hermann Cohn school of Kantianism, which is an antagonist in some ways to Heidegger, obviously, and others. But you know, this came out out of the Cohn school, and of course, Franz Rosenzweig's The Star of Redemption, you know, which is again something that has been read and reread, you know, as again this move of the Greek Jew, two extremes meet in some ways, you know, to play on Joyce, which is again another very interesting moment, you know, in philosophy, the privilege of sight, you know, in the Platonic universe, the eidos, the eidetic reduction. Husserl is really about theories of perception. You know, I know Carl wanted to read some Merleau-Ponty. The phenomenology of perception is really coming out of the Platonic moment as a projection in so many ways, whereas the, you know, the hearing is really more of Heidegger. Heidegger is really coming out of the hearing. You know, if you read his, again, look, these are lifetime projects, unfortunately, but if you read The Allegory of the Cave, which how he reads this in terms of Plato's idea of the truth, and Patrick, this is where you see really hermeneutics at work, right? The Heideggerian hermeneutics. You know, this is exceptional, the way he interprets the cave and the realm of shadows, the realm of images, etc. Yeah, but you begin to see that he really is about the hearing. It's about the hearing. We don't hear, we see. Yeah, right. We're only hearing. So he's going against his master Edmund Husserl, which is really the eidetic reduction theories of intentionality about the constituting of the I, right? The constituting of the objects in the world, and that activity of constituting, and you know, excuse me, but Heidegger in a way is about attuning the ear again to hear, you know, the dwelling, the thinking, right? Dwelling and building together. This is another beautiful essay of his about this actual saving, this redemption that is coming through the hearing, to be able to hear the text and hear the thing. So whatever you make of this, I mean, you know, you can be there and, you know, like in Werner Herzog's Agira, when the Indians are given the the Bible to read and they start shaking it up to their ears. You know, what are we listening to? Of course, could be a question, but in a sense, this is really, at least in my mind, is the art of listening, and to get out of picture thinking, right, in a certain way, and to see our time as one completely dominated by this age of the world picture, and how do we escape it? How do we liberate ourselves from it? Right? I mean, surveillance is a verb of sight, right? In a sense. I mean, you can hear surveillance, but you know, in a sense, you know, you all know the movie, you know, Coppola's The Conversation with Gene Hackman, and you know, et cetera. And we have things about this, but really, in a way, it's kind of getting out of the dominance of the story of the eidos in many ways. Yeah.
This is our last anti-Oedipus is kind of this schizoid moment, is in a sense this shares elements of this original Greek kind of being in the world,
right?
In a way, right?
Yes, exactly. If you follow Heidegger, I mean, again, I'm giving a lot of outside, you know, anecdotal stuff here, but this is based on his work. You know, if you read the contributions to philosophy, which are from 1935 to 37, 38, and you know, then of course the Black Notebooks, which have created quite a stir, you know, that he kept in it, and there are remarks in there that are very, very frighteningly, you know, barbaric in some ways. But on the other hand, the contributions to philosophy read like a schizophrenic text. You know, they read like a continual Maoist cultural revolution, and at the same time, it's like a schizophrenic text. Because again, he's trying to, you know, again, he's trying, I mean, I have ranking systems. I like sports a lot. So I think Heidegger is the most violent of the 20th century philosophers, Adorno the most intelligent, Benjamin the most creative. I do little things like this. But this is a real violence, that is going on between the German and the Greek. Yeah, Richard. Yeah, please. Yeah.
It's very interesting about the idea of listening. You got me onto another thought. As I always remember with Latin, the first verb you learn is love, and in ancient Greek, the first verb you learn is to destroy. Luo, which we get, but again, it goes into analysis to break something up.
Right.
But the whole, my first time I heard about the notion of hearing as Judaic thought was by a French psychoanalyst who was a friend of mine named Alain Didier-Weil, who wrote the book Quartier Lacan, in which he interviewed all these people who knew Lacan. Right. And it was really, he was talking about what Freud had taken from Judaism in a sense, or his Judaic roots, that, Freud, in turning the patient, in sitting behind the patient and listening to him, was kind of breaking the kind of the imaginary or the ego as this kind of visual control and bringing in the ear. And so that was kind of this. So to think of Heidegger, who's so famous as being, his connection to the Nazis, talking about anxiety of influence or something, that in a way his own thinking appropriated part of, or this is maybe going too far, but still that he is a thinker of the ear in sense versus the eye, or trying to get outside of the visual, given the importance of Jewish thought in reintroducing that in some ways through psychoanalysis into Western thought is pretty creepy.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So Heidegger is the Jew of Jews in some ways in the history of dominant philosophers in some ways. I mean, I'm just playing here, but it's interesting that Lyotard takes this up and others, do. So this is another way of looking at this. I mean, Derrida is not exactly, a Eastern Orthodox Christian when he writes Deficit of the Spirit, right? I mean, this is coming out of a position of a very deep outsider Jewish, Algerian Jew. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, and the hearing is always going on. And
right.
Again, very attuned to this in many ways. And of course, as you say, the Catholic, I think Lacan's brother, if I'm not mistaken, was a Catholic priest.
Right.
Yeah. So and so Lacan comes out of that other different tradition. So it's very, very interesting. And Lacan liked to say, I'm not Lacanian, I'm Freudian, right?
Right. Yes, absolutely.
So this whole thing of, look, I mean, in some ways, we're always in this political conundrum, right? We have to think about what's alive and well in the Marxist tradition. If there's any, what can we take from it? What about the problem of organization? All these kind of political questions that are going around, which are part of everydayness in a certain way, and are questions of representation at some level still, because we're thinking this through. But the question is there a path here? Or is this another conundrum? Because Heidegger understands this aporia that we've been faced with, right? I mean, are these systems, right, the real way out in this he calls it the confrontation with planetary technology. Is this the way out, right? In terms of, is the Bolshevik revolution, is the way out, right, in a sense. I mean, he had admiration for the Bolsheviks, international versus national socialism in a certain way, but again, I mean, what can we really get from this? To me, going back to what we were talking about earlier with David and Kristen, in a way, this is a subversion, if you will, of the policing of the mind, right? The policing by the institutions of the mind. And in a way, it's a kind of anarchy, but anarchy meaning away from principles, right? Once you understand the principle, you can move away, right? You're freed. It's a kind of liberation of thought from the dominant representational thinking or from the, the dominant codes of traditions. And also, I think this is what he's doing with philosophical anthropology too, and anthropology is a discipline, and psychology. One of the other things, and Patrick knows this about Dilthey, one of the antagonists in terms of methodology and consequences of psychology was psychologism. There was a fight against this kind of reductionistic moment in 19th century disciplinary practices. So they're going against it, and the tendency of biologism, right? In a way. So all of these things are kind of on the table for him, and again, trying to think of it, in a very different way. To my mind, just having done this, and listen, I'm no quote expert or whatever, but I mean, I think this thought, in some ways, it's going to take a long time to really understand where they really wants to go. I'm not trying to cop out and say, oh, this is going to be someone 100 years down the road, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done to think through where is this space, right, that he's talking about. And in a way, I think also what we can glean from this is one way out of the age of the world picture is to start thinking topologically, think place, no longer think space and time, but to think time and place, in a sense, in terms of, the topological rather than the old spatial dimensions here. So I don't know if David's still with us, but this is one thing one could start looking at, that basically surveillance, this COP strategic, realities, communications is based on spatial relations, not relations of place, not topological in a way. So, and there's a mathematics there as well, topology and mathematics that Lacan took up too. These were no fools, these people. I mean, they understood the stakes in a way. There's a lot of freedom. Carl, you want to say something? Yeah. Carl? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I've been having internet connection problems, so some of this is, but this is like sort of my introduction to Heidegger. So a lot of this is probably extremely naive, but just I guess this is one an observation, and then a couple of questions. Is a lot of what I got in sort of the conversations, the thing that I link it to, in some ways, is Adorno and Horkheimer, the dialectic of enlightenment, and it seems very much this notion Heidegger is putting forward of instrumental domination.
Right.
That the picture of the world, the human as subject, as the center of the world, is very linked, it seems, to this idea of conquering, mastering, dominating the world. And so it seems like the way out for him, if that's, and then I see he associates that with, as I understand it, humanism and this kind of philosophy, this anthropology of man, so to speak, and that comes out of Descartes. And as I recall, I read Dialectic of Enlightenment 30 years ago, but it was a very similar argument that they make, although they have different reference points, but this idea of kind of the instrumental domination of nature and subjectivity. So I guess, I don't know enough about Heidegger's overall politics and his trajectory, but it seems that sort of the route out is overcoming that dichotomy, or that sort of, I mean, that seems to me to be his critique. But then I had like the questions, if people want to think these are relevant questions, is that in some ways, like, it seems that his phenomenological method replicates the problem he's trying to escape, to me.
Well, tell me what
I don't know if that's true, but it seems like,
you
well, I mean, in some sense, he's sort of grounding.
I'm sorry.
I would have to think about that more, but and again, this is a first read, and it's just kind of like an impression. But it seems that there is a way that he's trying, like, how does he ultimately overcome this when the point of view is how, the world is constituted for us, through us, and by us? And, it seems like he's trying to sort of overcome that, right, and the consequences of that. But, again, I might be totally off base, but it was just something that struck me.
It's a good question to hold on to. Where does this all come from? I mean, are we beings through which being passes, right? Is our design, are there being our topological space, a place where we're open to that, those moments, right, if you will, or we're open to something that will pass through us as vessels or as openings, right? And is this something, I mean, you could say it's mystical, but is it really, in terms of the sending, that is happening, in order to think way outside, the representational box, if you will, right? Way outside the subjectivity box, in a sense, and how does that work, in a sense? I mean, some people say this leads to a new kind of religiosity or a mystification, and other people are saying, yes, no, it's a path, where we're taking, he wrote again, essays. I mean, Holtz Vega posts, signposts along the way, the path marks, if you will, in the forest. So, I mean, this is a thinker, again, who, again, I think is saying, look, we've reached this conundrum through representational thinking, right? We have reached this point of where we're dominated by worldview, by Weltanschauung, and we're also dominated by the build, the image thinking, right? Picture thinking completely. So how do we,
Yeah, just to say
go ahead, I'm sorry.
One more thing.
Yeah, I mean.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was just listening, and I think the idea of the sense I'm getting is that Heidegger wants to provoke a kind of a reopening to the world in some way. It seems like that's when you said listening, I thought that was really interesting, because listening, like sight, there's actually a whole neurobiology about this. About the sight is a much more kind of self-focused and directive sense. And listening actually is a very diffuse sense. And it's, if you actually really listen to the world, you can just get out of yourself in some way. So it seems like that's interesting, that's kind of, but it's not quite clear to me what the passage is to that in some way. Like what is that in terms of practice? So anyway, these just interesting. And then the final thing I was just going to say is, at times I felt like, well, what is the presupposition of the metaphysics he's describing? Because in some sense it seems a little idealist to me. But that's I guess another question.
I mean, the metaphysics goes all the way back, I mean, the whole tradition. For Heidegger, the tradition of metaphysics.
Where does
Nietzsche? Yeah, I mean, this is really the metaphysical trajectory that he wants to take on. Idealist, yes, realist, or materialist isn't. It's these first principles that he's going through. And the history of being adheres to one concept during a particular epoch. So he's thinking through epochal thinking, like Marx thinks through historical periods, right, based on labor and et cetera. We go from slave society to feudalism. We're destroying. You see the destruction. The advent of the bourgeoisie, the dual class structure, and many other things. But Marx will speak to gradations here, and certainly Engels too, in his views of history. For Heidegger, this is about epochs, right? Epochs of being, right? that are going on, and that you have one central concept. I'm not so sure I agree with this, but this is his thinking, that you have one central concept that defines and delimits an area, right? And this is the one in Greek thinking. And he mentions Parmenides right before where we were starting with that question, I think on page 130. What is this question of the one? What is this question? And this still haunts us today. Deleuze and Guattari are going to talk about the multiplicity, the multiple, the multitude in Negre and Hart. you begin to see these things, playing out in a different way that come a lot out of these principles that he's developing and this thinking, right? This goes back to the ancient society. Then what is that epochal moment that shifts to natura, right? Then maybe end with Spinoza, with natura natura, and nature naturing, etc. What is that concept? How does that develop, and what does it do? And I mean, I'm this is again a general sketch. And then, of course, our epoch, where we're talking about tonight, is dominated by the self and self-consciousness. It's not dominated by open thinking for Heidegger, right? We're trapped. We're trapped in ourselves, right, in a certain way. Freud could be an advance on that because he said, look, this ego that we take for granted is not the master in its own house. There's something much more powerful going on. And in some ways, Heidegger is saying something similar. I'm not saying that they're together. Don't hear me this way. But in a way, they're facing a similar aporia, right? How do we get out of this dominant, self-consciousness, right? So yeah. And again, yeah. And Kristen put something, thinking towards the future. This is a futural philosophy, right? This is not a philosophy that's trapped, right, if you will, in the past, or cynical, or sits down and says, I'm skeptical of change or whatever. It is futurally oriented. We haven't approached it yet. It's much, maybe a little different than Nietzsche's The Open Sea, right? Or the open horizon where we have no idea, and we're beyond good and evil. We don't have, in a sense, what latest, evil will befall us. But yeah, I mean, he's very futural. It's a temporality that is not linear, that is not concentric, etc. It's a movement, it's an emergence, it's a springing forth, if you will, into the future. It's much like a vaulting into the future, a catapulting into the future. And in that moment, that ecstasis, this temporality of ecstasis, it's the future that brings us stuff, just like Lacan and Freud. Anxiety is not from the past that you had only these thoughts. It's the future that's doing this to you, right? In many ways. That's what you're really, yeah, Richard, please. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just going to bring, it's interesting I was just thinking about selling oneself, whereas I'm out there pitching this film, Adieu Lacan, and with, people, what we have to do and market and distribute it. And you literally have to get yourself in the picture, put yourself, you're making these Zooms with the other filmmakers and then cutting them with scenes. But, you think of the phenomena of TikTok or all these, there's a way in which we literally, and I think about this in terms of us, what it says about today's subjectivity, but of constantly putting ourselves in the picture. I mean, literally, that's kind of something I so admire Beckett and Thomas Pynchon, because they've, you can't find any photos of them, or at least that they stayed pretty much. No, that's not true of Beckett, but by and large, or at least they. At least that's what I know of them. But certainly today there's a way in which, to make this film exist. It's like, well, you have to send out tweets. You're not tweeting. Well, you have to do. But it's, you're literally putting yourself. People now, we put ourselves in the picture so much. It's like a kind of malady. That you can really see has kind of taken over, or at least really, is very actual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm in total agreement with you. This is the total projection. I guess this is why you yourself and Godard, Wim Wenders, and others created their own production company early on, so they don't have to be fully subjected to this kind of stuff. But anyway,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is important too. I mean, I think you brought up something great last week about Godard's saying that it's not about sheltering, right? It's more about preserving. And I think this is very appropriate to Heidegger, right? There is no real sheltering here, right? In a sense, right? This needs to be violently broken. into preserving something, that is there, but so futurally oriented. It's really a vast rupture, if you will, from the past. I mean, in so many ways, and past thinking, and yeah. And I think this is very important to remember, that you don't save phenomena by sheltering it; you preserve, right? And this would be a very good way of thinking about this, preserving in its relationship to presencing, in a sense too, versus that of representation of being in the picture or being on the scene, right? What is that difference there?
Yes.
Yeah. And if you look at Marx too, going back to dialectic of enlightenment that Carl brought up, Marx is always speaking about my method of presentation is different than my method of research. So the staying beforehand, the Vorstellung versus the Darstellung, all part of this Stellung, this family of verbs in the German language. It's very important too, because Marx, in some ways, in his way, and I mean, Heidegger never really engaged this, is, I think, also trying to get out of representational thinking, especially with the phrase, the poetry of the future, right? He has no intention of going back to the poetry of the past. He's talking the poetry that will face us in the future. It's very interesting in this way, So I mean, there are these moments that Kostas Axelos, certainly Kostas Papayannou of the Greek French philosophers who ended up in France, certainly took on this way. Henri Lefebvre, to my mind, again, this kind of synthetic ground between Heidegger and Marx, from the everydayness, to this advent of modernity, etc. Then ultimately going back to the Greeks with rhythm analysis, right? Which is interesting too. He's very, very situated that way, thinking through rhythm and hearing again. So this again is, very, very important for our purposes. Anyway, Jocelyn, you have any thoughts here? Are we? Yeah.
I'm taking some notes. I mean, I think that the comment. I think it was Richard. I think you were talking about the issue of the picture and the painting. I was sort of thinking about that too, and interested in. I guess I was also thinking about Benjamin and the way that he uses the image, and I was kind of wondering about. Thinking about the way Benjamin, depending on what translation, but the image and the picture, or the image in Benjamin and the picture in Heidegger. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
You anticipate some of the division here that we're going to do when we read the work of art in the age of technical reproduction. It's a very different approach,
Right.
So yeah, I mean that to me again is part of the historical encounter, or if you will, from a historical materialist position, how to go about things, right? To try to frame this. These are both thinkers out of Weimar, right? And that they go different ways. Heidegger makes no comments about Fritz Lang or von Sternberg or other filmmakers of the German cinema, nor very, very little about modernist painting. He talks about Braque, George Braque, who was a friend of his. He does, do an analysis of the shoes of the peasant of Van Gogh, which is around this time, 1935, a year or two earlier. But we can talk about this in terms of, and I think Patrick mentioned it earlier, reflective judgment, the Kantian notion of reflective judgment, and look at this from a greater standpoint than everyday taste, and think about what is happening here. Yeah, and no, these are very good points. Yeah, I mean, and for Benjamin, perhaps the image has a very positive effect, in a way, because you have to remember Benjamin is also writing for, the author's producer of texts that will resonate in the working class. Heidegger doesn't have that in mind, right? He's speaking, in a way, as a philosopher, somewhat with many steps back, right? There's taking steps back. So we can think of it that way too. Yeah.
That's really, I mean, I guess I was also thinking, I think brought it up last meeting. It's interesting to think about, or I find it interesting to think about Benjamin's seeming, well, some of his positive ideas about the potential of technology and what progress can mean in that context,
Right.
is contrasted with historiography and concepts of progress in Benjamin too. So those were also a couple of things that I was thinking about.
Right. Right. Well, think of a man with the movie camera. It's very influential on
Right.
Vertoft's, very influential on Benjamin. And for those of you who don't, he was involved with a Russian actress who was very pro-Bolshevik for a long time. And, he wrote the Moscow Diary, and you can see Benjamin's growth in this way. Very different figure than Horkheimer and Adorno, a very different kind of, I call Benjamin sort of the man of the valise. He was the traveler of all of them, in many ways. And and it's a shame we lost him, because there's no telling, what could have come out of this. Yeah. I mean, this is very rich work, based on the thing. But he also knew the history of the hearing too. It's not like he was denying that. But it seems like that this would be important. Yeah. So I mean, again, this will raise questions, and we can talk about this as well. Translation too. Benjamin wrote The Task of the Translator, and Heidegger's, what is his translation, right? In some ways, in this long, bringing together of a grouping of the Greek. Heidegger's antagonist really is imperialism, Roman imperialism, and the Latinate, dominance of history, of philosophy. He really wants to get away from this, in a way, and really disturb the Judeo-Christian, infiltration in the history of philosophy. This is one of his ambitions, if you will. Yeah.
Well, but what I guess, again, this may be an incredibly naive question, but just I'm trying to just sort of, how does Heidegger see himself situated in the actual period he's living in historically? Who is he talking to? What is sort of the project that he would see coming forth from developing his mode of thought? Is it purely philosophical in that sense, that this is sort of the end in and of itself? But it seems to me like he's trying to get to something else, right? That there is to the future. But so I'm just curious. It sounds like a lot of people here are pretty well versed in Heideggerian thought, and just how do people see how he situates himself, his own self-understanding of his project, beyond sort of the negative critique, right? Beyond sort of the critique of philosophical anthropology,
in a couple of words, I mean, I think he sees himself as a really thinker of a new path, a new way, if you will, a new way that is necessary in this encounter. He speaks to this often, planetary technology, right? This is one of the codes that he is going to engage. How are we to confront technological determinism, technological domination, and how can we actually build a path, both methodologically, and topologically, in which we are able to use the technology as a liberating moment instead of dominating us, as subjects, as surveillance, as new kind forms of policing, etc. And he sees cybernetics as a kind of enemy, right? In many ways, right? It is not the progress it's meant to be, right? In many ways. So he sees this in terms of not only the Galilean, and the mathematization of nature, but the mathematization of everything. He would not be surprised in terms of algorithmic terms like algorithmic governmentality that goes around today. He would say this is a necessary progression of what's happened since what we're discussing tonight. It's an outgrowth, it's a consequence, right? Not surprising at all to him, because we have not shifted away from this kind of dependence on the mathematical, and this is also in this, I mean, this is a very rich, I mean, whether, again, you agree, I mean, there are all kinds of moments here, the mathematical and scientific research, how this is working in terms of Heidegger, what it does, and we'll see this play out later again in the question of technology, concerning technology with reserve stock, the Gestalt, how we become inframed. We're not breaking that frame at all. We're becoming inframed constantly, So, I mean, to go back to the image world of the cinema or world of the photograph, we're snapshot all the time, and we're inframed in that, both by the painting, by the image, etc. This world picture. So he's trying to crack this in a certain way. There's a kind of fracturing that's going on.
Is it a return to nature? I mean, it's almost like this. The sense I get from what people are saying is that it's like a return to nature, but in a different way that's more listening rather than kind of the instrumental mathematicization of mapping, right? Of a certain kind of coding of the world in a very quantitative sense. It seems like he's almost trying to get back to something more fundamental in. Is that? Do you think that that's?
We have forgotten the question of being. This is his whole thing, that forgetting of the question of being. We cannot hear being, right? We cannot hear being. We don't know the meaning of being, and what path will we take to get to that?
Is Michael?
Yeah.
Is part of the like the epochal thinking that like part of the problematic there is that we're thinking the world picture and how to sort of get out of it from within the world picture. So like we don't actually have a position outside of this epoch. So as we like consider the epoch from within, it's hard to say, even impossible to say, here's what comes next, because we're not in what comes next. We're in this, which I think maybe is one of the reasons Heidegger tries to solve this, and tell me if I'm getting this right, by reaching back to the Greeks and then translating them through, mid 20th century Germany. Because like thinking the future is like has to be rethinking a part of the past, because the past is something that he can reach back to and like rework, where there is no like future outside of the world picture that you can like get to, grasp onto, bring back into the world picture, and then tell everybody about, like, getting out of the cave and coming back. Like we're doing all of this work from within the epoch we're trying to address. And of course, like the thing about this epoch is it captures everything, right? Like it captures the whole world, including history and the understandings of the world that take place within it, and everything else.
Yeah. I mean, again, there's a diagnostic here that we're entrapped. I mean, whether there's a prescriptive, is another story, right? The diagnostic is, we have forgotten the question of being. We don't know how to hear. And when Carl says, yes, go back in hearing nature, Heidegger is very much a man who says we have forgotten to hear the river. We have forgotten to hear, these are very beautiful passages. You'll see it in the question concerning technology. And again, I've mentioned this film to some people here. Der Ister, is the reading of Hölderlin's poem. It's very beautiful. It's a movie done by Daniel Ross, of which Bernard Stiegler, Jean-Luc Nancy, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, and what's the Hans-Jürgen Cederberg, the German filmmaker, the one that did Our Hitler, all make commentary on Heidegger, right? And the reading of Hölderlin as this moment. So in a way, he wants to go back to this thinking of the homecoming, right? In some ways, this has been a criticism that there's a kind of nostalgia here for German Romanticism, or Hölderlin as being the major figure here. But Hölderlin had a both left and right following, right, in a sense, too. You have to remember Hölderlin very, very important to many of the better left philosophers of the period, including Lukács and others. So, I mean, Heidegger is really trying to think again, look, again, the German language, and I don't speak German, I read some of it, but Wesen, which is usually translated essence, is a very active movement, right? It doesn't mean you're essentializing or you're fixing a definition. It's process, right? Process is always at work here, once again. So when he talks about the essence of poetry, he's talking about poetry as an essence, or the essence of truth, which is another thing he does. So this is not again, this is not a small mind at work or just another guy that's Heil Hitlering around, et cetera. Nor is he, yeah. I mean, this is a major thinker who's taking on every major concern, technology, how we've come to get to this point. He's really looking at how we got here, right? He doesn't give you a prescriptive step by step. It's not like, the Deleuze and Guattari opening of Anti-Oedipus. The unconscious doesn't ask why, it asks how. It asks how. How do we do something? Heidegger's not asking the how, or he's not giving you the steps in that direction. He's trying to point, if you will. This is a kind of a pointing, if you will, out of the morass and the liberation. So in a way, yeah. I mean, yeah, this is good to keep in mind. Yeah, and so he's going to really be, again, to me, the important part. And again, if we can read him this way, I think it's going to be great value. He's really teaching us how to question, I think. This is really the lesson that's being imparted. This is where I think he goes further than a Delphi, who's also brilliant on the human sciences and laying groundwork. Maybe his hermeneutic, Heidegger's hermeneutic, is more imaginative in some ways, but really this path of questioning that he brings up. It's really this questioning that's very important. How do we ask the question today? How do we ask the question? How do we, step outside? How do we get outside of this? I mean, Gramsci, for example, asked the question, how do we struggle in the nuclei of common sense? Common sense includes everything, right? In a certain way, the sense of the community, the direction of the community, at the same thing, all this empiricism we're subjected to. And Gramsci says the only way you're going to get out of common sense is to take a step beyond into good sense, which gives you order to a new kind of thinking. This is on the way to philosophy of praxis, which was Marxism for him. It was a code word when he was in prison. How do we get out of that? Oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I got a stupid new phone. Anyway, speaking of hearing. Anyway, this again, I think for us to really learn from this, right? And to raise these questions, these are all great questions in a sense. And I mean, I chose Benjamin because he's different, right? We're going to see a lot of difference. We're going to see the Frankfurt School on another side, even though, as Jocelyn pointed out, there's much in common. There are many common characteristics, right? Yeah, that are happening, right? Between the two. And as Carl said, this whole domination of nature, what the dialectic of enlightenment is about at some levels, and over this period. So yeah, and again, look, I'm not so sure that the way out is a dialogue with, the pre-Socratics and, that Plato was the evil that, stopped the Greeks, the systematic outside of the intuitive thinking of the pre-Socratics, that we have to get back to that, the uncorrupted thought, or whatever you want to say. We have to go back to a radical naivete, if you will, to begin to think again. I'm not so sure about that, but there is some kind of pointing this way, that you need this rerouting of a naivete, to go back, So yeah.
I thought it was interesting, Michael, that he's very specific up front about like the one of his interlocutors being the view of science as progress, right? That which sets up obviously the engagement with the Greeks, that a return to the Greeks isn't necessarily a return to a previously a less advanced time, because science just doesn't work like that. So what we think of as science is this very specific relationship to method and institutions, and shouldn't be seen as necessarily the pinnacle of understanding. And we might have to go way back in order to find an advancement from where we are in our relationship to the world and understanding.
Right. I mean, again, he has this long section on experiment and experience, right? On the Greek word and how that has been distorted too. In some ways, he's trying to correct these Latinate distortions and the way science takes up the vocabulary. That's another thing too. Yeah, yeah. So that's going on. I mean, I think this is early on in the essay. And I don't know, I would like to continue with this next week, just to ground us in his thinking, and then go on to the question concerning technology, and then we'll go on to the Benjamin, and of course, the modern thinking of this in the age of digitalization with Stiegler and Kittler, who are both tremendously influenced by both, I think more Stiegler is influenced more by the Frankfurt School than Kittler is, but we'll talk about that. I mean, Stiegler is a very interesting amalgamation of the Heideggerian, Derridian moment, and then of course André Leroy-Gourhan, the gesture and speech that Matt last week put up in the chat, and then of course all the stuff of digitalization. Kittler is much closer to Heidegger. In fact, he admits the master he has is Heidegger. It's very interesting. Even though he's going to deal with optical media, typewriter, gramophone, film, these are some of his books, the discourse networks, and a lot of the essays he wrote. So, yeah, let me just see, he goes through, this section on the experiment on, page 123. Aristotle was the first who understood what empiria means. Experientia means the observation of things themselves, right? Their qualities and modifications under changing conditions, and consequently the observation that aims at such knowledge, the experimentum, remains essentially different from the observation that belongs to science as research, right? Very important. Well, belongs to science. From the research experiment, it remains essentially different, even when ancient and medieval observation also works with number and measure, and even when that observation makes use of specific apparatus and instruments. For in all this, that which is decisive about the experiment is completely missing. To set up an experiment means to represent or conceive the conditions under which a specific series of motions can be made susceptible to being followed in its necessary progression. That is, of being controlled in advance by calculation. But the establishment of the law is accomplished with reference to the ground plan of the object sphere. That ground plan furnishes a criterion and constrains the anticipatory representing of the conditions. Such representing in and through which the experiment begins is not random or randoming imaging. This is why Newton said, hypothesis non fingo, the bases that are laid down are not arbitrarily invented. They are developed out of the ground plan of nature and are sketched into it. Experiment is that methodology which, as in the planning and execution, is supported and guided on the basis of the fundamental law laid down, in order to adduce the facts that either verify or confirm the law or deny its confirmation. The more exactly the ground plan of nature is projected, the more exact becomes the possibility of experiment. Hence, and this is Frankfurt School too, this is early Horkheimer, Materialism and Metaphysics. Hence, the much cited medieval schoolman Roger Bacon can never be the forerunner of the modern experimental research scientist. Rather, he merely is a successor of Aristotle. For in the meantime, the real locus of truth had been transferred by Christendom to faith, to the infallibility of the written word, and to the doctrines of the church. The highest knowledge and teaching is theology as the interpretation of the divine word of revelation, which is set down in scripture and proclaimed by the church. Here, to know is not to search out, rather it is to rightly understand the authoritative word, right? And the authorities proclaiming it. Therefore, the discussion of the words and doctrinal opinions of the various authorities takes precedence in the acquiring of knowledge in the Middle Ages. The componere scripta est sermonis and the argument ex verbo, which is interesting, how you argue from the words versus arguing for the thing, is decisive, and at the same time is the reason why the accepted Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy that had been taken over had to be transformed into scholastic dialect. So he's really looking at this epochal shift, right? Nature, authority, the doctrines of the church, right, etc. Yeah. If now Bacon demands the experimentum, and he does demand it, he does not mean the experiment of science as research. In fact, he wants the argumentum out of the thing instead of the argument ex verbo, the careful observing of things themselves, i.e., Aristotelian empiria instead of the discussion of doctrines. The modern research experiment, however, is not only an observation made precise in degree and scope, but is a methodology essentially different in kind, related to the verification of law in the framework and at the service of an exact plan of nature. And this is interesting too for those of you using a lot of citations. And source criticism is the historical humanistic sciences. In the humanistic sciences, corresponds to experiment in physical research, right? Hence, the name source criticism designates the whole gamut of the discovery, examination, verification, evaluation, preservation, and interpretation of sources. Historiographical explanation, which is, this is, I mean, really good stuff, right? Is based on source criticism, does not. It is true, trace facts back to its laws and rules, but neither does it confine itself to the mere reporting of facts. In the historical sciences, just in the natural sciences, the methodology aims at representing what is fixed, stable, and in making history an object. History can become objective only when it is past. What is stable in what is past, that on the basis of which historiographical explanation reckons up the solitary and the divisive in history, is the always has been once already the comparable. Through the constant comparing of everything with everything which is intelligible, is found by calculation and certified and established as the ground plan of history. The sphere of historiographical research extends only so far as historiographical explanation reaches. The unique, the rare, the simple, and so are the great in history is never self-evident and hence remains inexplicable, right? Such as revolution, right? In a certain way. What really, we can look at all the causes and the backgrounds, but what actually is that moment of spontaneity of the being of revolution that actually is the overthrow of something previous or, in many ways. So anyway, so in explaining the great is measured against the ordinary and the average, and there's no other historiographical explanation as long as explaining means reduction to what is intelligible, and so long as historiography remains research, that is an explaining. Because historiography is research, projects and objectivize the past in the sense of an explicable, and surveyable nexus of actions and consequences. It requires source criticism as its instrument of objectification. The standards of this criticism alter to the degree that historiography approaches journalism. So again, he's criticizing this tendency, and this goes on today all the time, philosophical journalism, right? There's journalism that also plays alongside anthropology. You see another example here. So he's really taking on, again, this reportage, right? This kind of anecdotal approach, right, et cetera, that the storytellers are to be kicked out. Yeah, Richard, yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just, looking at the Greek, about empiria,
right?
And what comes across to me in the context of what he's talking about, it literally is from testing something, from trying it out. It's
right.
Very, you could say, and not by chance, this is a good way of putting it, hands-on. If you think about the importance of the hand in Greek thought and everything, versus, what he's saying about, the institutions, this kind of a way in which there's a detachment from this more fundamental approach that he finds in the Greeks in Aristotle, of a way of being a different in a different way from what he finds in this age of the image.
I like the use of testing because, in a sense, what Heidegger is hinting at is that our age is very afraid of the danger, right? of
Yes.
right. This is really what expedie, really means, that you're really close to the danger. You're both
Right.
in and out of the danger in a certain way. So this dangerous thought, etc., is very, very important in this moment of discovery, the new, getting out the calculable, the predictable, all of these kind of things. So I think that this is, again, important. He's going to speak about this in terms of technology, as well as, again, how to get outside of representational thinking. Because again, he's describing what representational thinking is. This displacement of the Aristotelian notion of what it means to test, in a sense, and how the modern research project is so far away from that. Yeah. And remember, I want to say this too. I mean, look, again, I know we're not doing, quote, professional philosophical textual exegesis here, but in a sense, this is someone that is studying the book 4 on motion, place in Aristotle of the physics, right? This is a very much of a part of what he's doing here, right? He's really taking that study and making it much more applicable to our world, orienting us. And I like the word orientation rather than you apply. It's a kind of orientation rather than an applied kind of, new danger, if you will, an orienting to this danger of the testing, as you were saying, Richard. Yeah. So we forget this in many ways. We really forget this in so many ways, right? Just look at the way the government tells us about the pandemic. We have to be certain about the 3rd booster shot. We're not really talking about what's involved here. Ultimately, you have the typical reductionist anti-vaxxers. Those that are in the dark, but we're not really speaking to what is really coming down here. In terms of thinking, what is going on in this moment. And shouldn't the risk really be a new kind of immunology, a new type of approach to public health? This is the last thing on anybody's mind, right? The last thing of anybody in power. Not talked about at all. Not even our good old friend Bernie Sanders. I'm just kidding, but anyway, we're not seeing it. Right?
So, Michael, I have a question. This was just one of the things that really struck me, is maybe this is an irrelevant question for Heidegger. Maybe it implies too much of a way of thinking that's about explanation in a certain way, but it was kind of like, where does the ground plan come from? I found it very interesting. We had talked about this a little last week, where he says, modern physics is mathematical because mathematics corresponds to an understanding of the world, a picture of the world that is already, in some sense, mathematical. And I found that really interesting. And just, where does the ground plan seems like pretty fundamental to his whole argumentative development, before he begins to, but that really seems like the constituting foundation. And it was interesting to me because he doesn't really seem bothered or need to explain it. It's almost like it's this fundamental presupposition that itself has no presupposition.
Well, the ground plan is obviously part of the projection of the metaphysical principles that are at work, right? So the Cartesian rationality is part of the ground plan.
Yes.
Right? That's what he's speaking to in terms of the ground, right? In a sense, it's the Grund and the plan of that ground. The ground's the project, right? In a sense, right? So yeah. So for him,
what is the plan? I mean, in some sense, and maybe that's not a fair question. Maybe it's not an important question.
It's just you're doing a Cartesian move there, in a sense. You're asking, what is the object here, right? Or what is the objective? This is not the kind of thinking he wants to get involved with. It's not teleological.
No, I think
it's not an objective or whatever. It's, again, a way of questioning, what these plans are, where they lead, etc. So you have to think of this as a diagnostic, not as much as a prescriptive right away, right? This is,
I think I'm thinking of it more in a Marxian sense of,
yeah,
trying to understand, the underlying forces that give rise to certain, moments of thought. And I'm not, it has its limits, to think in that perspective also. But I'm thinking of it more of kind of a historical materialist reading. I mean, Marx, I think, would, if you ask him what's the fundamental metaphysic of the age, he would say it's capital. I mean, it's the dominating force that subsumes everything else. And
I would say the tendency of idealism to have taken the day and that the world is topsy-turvy. He would begin there. It wouldn't be capital. Capitalism's a system, right, of which it governs. But you have to take a step back from that and say, yeah, how did the capitalism, what relationship does this have to Cartesian metaphysics? What does it have to calculated rationality? How do all these things come together, in that moment? What is the thought behind it? Capitalism is the result, right? In a sense, right? It's not yeah. You see what I'm saying? I mean, yeah. I mean, this is the way. Yeah.
yeah,
I think
it,
that
yeah,
I think one of the things he gets at, he uses in this the
Yeah.
notion of, and not to sound like Alain Badiou, but the notion of event.
Yes.
There's a historical
Yes.
background
Yes.
that basically, to take the language from being in time, that creates a clearing
Right.
at a particular point in history.
Right.
And it's almost like it's something that which is given to us. It has it's not an irrational, but not a rational. It just it takes place.
The gift of time, if you will, and the givenness of time, given time, if you want to think of it that way. And
which in some ways is very similar. Is very similar to Marx in the sense that the event, which primitive accumulation constitutes basically the exchange relation, and subsumes. I mean, first, in different levels of subsumption that Marx talks about, but it's very similar in terms of this logic that is imposed by a historical event.
Right.
That's interesting. I mean, when I was reading it, again, I was thinking some of Foucault and, sort of these regimes that Foucault talks about. And it seems like I felt like there was a certain, I mean, I was interested to read in Heidegger, and it seemed like he was kind of anticipating everything.
Well, Heidegger, Foucault's the second to third level positivist in the Heideggerian system. I mean, discursive regularities and what Foucault is doing in the archaeology of knowledge is basically a rethinking of the fundamental ontology through, labor, life, and language, right? And basically discursive regularities are basically his way of trying to work through epistemes instead of epochal thinking, where you have the shift in a particular knowledge production, and it sets up a new discursive regularity in the system, that people begin.
But isn't that similar to what Heidegger is calling kind of a ground plan in some way? I mean, it seems like there's these fundamental.
He's against epistemology once again. Yeah.
But but Foucault's kind of, I guess the way I.
Yeah. I don't know if we're gonna. Yeah. I mean, Foucault, again, he reads Heidegger, he leaves the Communist Party because they have Heidegger on the blacklist. That's what happens. You're not allowed to read Heidegger in the 50s, So this is kind of interesting in a sense, right? In the French Communist Party. So Foucault gave up his membership and went to become Michel Foucault, thinker of mental illness psychology, et cetera. But again, I mean, look, this is fundamental ontology that he's dealing with here, that he's trying to, again, confront Dilthey's notion of the human sciences, although he's tremendously influenced in dialogue. It's a new kind of hermeneutic that he's trying to do as well, that's subjectless, if you will, the givenness of time, epochal time in many ways, right? An epoch, right? Not Yeah, and in a sense, he's trying to think through these epochs. You know, I mean, Foucault is going to think about regimes, but Heidegger thinks of in within those epochs how everything becomes dominated by the thinking of the one, or how everything becomes dominated by the thinking of nature, or now how everything becomes dominated by the question of the self and self-consciousness or consciousness. So this is where he's coming from. So again, he's sort of again going back to this notion of ground plan. Heidegger is kind of giving you the grand epic form, if you will, for this kind of thinking. If you want to think of the French philosophers, maybe not so much Benjamin, we'll see, etc. But and maybe some people in the Frankfurt School, but certainly in terms of the influence on the French, and then the influence on the Kittlers and the Stieglers, who to me are at least in translated forms some of the most important thinkers of our time. And how do you think outside the Anthropocene? Stiegler has a notion of the negotrophic scene. We have these other notions of capital scene that the Marxists like. We have all these new scenes, right, in a way. But when you begin to think of scenes too, in some ways, again, the site comes back. If you're going to think about Heidegger, are we doing more of a Foucaultian analysis of the new knowledge productions of our time, and we're losing the sense of where we should be thinking the new orientations? Good question. I mean,
Oh, so you're saying, like, in some sense, Heidegger is operating, you see it as at a more fundamental level than
oh, yeah.
than what?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, you're looking at primary ground, Urgrund, the abyssal plane, the Abgrund, right? Outside of this, which could be considered the irrational in some ways, and then of course the Grund itself. And he has a book called the Ground Problems of Phenomenology, in which he points out the methodology of destruction, positive reconstruction, etc. Right? Retrieval. How do you retrieve something? We'll talk about this later, in terms of retention too, retention and protension, and also retention going back and into the past, but how that becomes futural in its way. Right? So, yeah. So, I mean, we have to give up a little bit of our logic, if you will, our usual logic, to kind of, follow the thinking. I'm not saying, be driven and completely taken in by Heidegger, but just to see the logic of the thought once again, to see his thought at work, to think with, that to me is really good reading, to my mind, that you think with, and then you can make your thing. You have questions along the way, but I think it's very, we've mentioned, because of all our education, in a sense, we bring this kind of superimposition and prejudice always to a reading, and we forget to think with the thinker. You're dealing with a philosopher, not just a journalist. That you know what I mean. You're not reading the New Yorker here, or
Oh, really?
Yeah. He never made it. He never made it to the school of writing. Anyway, listen, I see people are leaving. I guess it's getting time. I mean, I know we'll get one night where we'll go to 10 o'clock or 10:30 if people, but anyway, why don't we read some more of this next week? I'll start putting up some stuff with Matt, on the YouTube. I know last week's was there, and then this week's as well. So we'll try to draw some connections here. But again, I want to emphasize, if you think with them, I think you're going to get something out of this, at least to understand, right? To me, understanding is crucial for that hermeneutic, that interpretation. And then hopefully it's somewhat transformative of a triad of reading, the understanding, the interpretation of that understanding, and then finally, is it transformative? Does it really change us? Does it really change perception? Does it change something fundamentally for us, going forward? And, this is his task. Like I said, this is someone that's really shaking foundations, shaking up a whole history. This is a rewriting of the history of Western ontology. This is no small project, right? in many ways. right? And I don't think the insights of Horkheimer and Adorno particularly, I think Benjamin is a different story and why I wanted to read him instead of reading the Dialectic of Enlightenment. But anyway, I don't think Horkheimer and the Dialectic of Enlightenment is possible without this book, right? Without some of the thinking of, especially Being and Time. And then, of course, also Lukács's History and Class Consciousness. These are the two, at least fundamental books of the philosophical tradition in the 20th century, out of which, the left, if, we consider, since the left forum sponsors this, if we're looking at this from a left, position or positionality, if you will. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So next week, why don't we finish this? I think we have a lot to do on the science, and then the appendixes are great. And we can take up this whole humanism thing again. I mean, I don't know how you think about this, that anthropology is to be put, aside, and this is a long question too. What about philosophical anthropology? And it goes back to Kant, right? Yeah. And look, I mean, in the for example, number 6 on the properly to the essence of the picture is a standing together. This is the appendix, page 141, and this might be interesting that we can talk about again. What is this picture thinking itself? So number 6 in the appendix and 7, right, are very important, right? And then the man is the measure, the protagonist that I mentioned too in number 8. So maybe we could begin next week, maybe put this out there, 6 through 8, and maybe give us a very, a kind of deeper understanding of what's going on here, right? Since yeah. I mean, yeah, so this would work, and we can do that next week. As I said, we won't be finished in 10 sessions. If you want, it's up to you guys, yeah. But anyway, I think I think we have a lot of material here for another week at least, to get grounded.
Are we going to start on the question concerning technology?
No, I think we should finish the Age of the World picture first, the 1936. Question concerning technology is many years later. Yeah. So yeah. So I would like to kind of ground this before he comes to a deeper understanding of technology, because we're going to have a different relationship to the Greek then and the German, right? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. So how image becomes structured image, right? This is very important for the picture thinking too, and also very important for maybe Benjamin. We could hold that. Gebild and Bildung and Gelbildung, structured education, structured cultural formation, right, versus that of just the image formation, right, etc. Right? How is this different in many ways, and how is this going on? Again, if we read this as process, I think we're going to get much more out of it. Yeah. I like to tell my some of the students who are listening, very few, but anyway, that it's more about the process than the product. They're always, what's going my grade? What do I have to do to get the grade? Et cetera, et cetera. So just undergo some thinking, undergo some experience with the text. So yeah, but they don't read; they Google. That's what they say. I don't read; we Google. That's the new slogan out there, right? And I guess that's yeah. This is why we're where we are. Yeah. So
what year was this text written? It looks
1938.
Like
it was delivered.
Okay, and the question concerning technology is 1955. It looks like.
Yeah, in the 50s. Yes, early on. With the cybernetic. This is after Norbert Wiener and others, and the cybernetic space had opened up pretty clearly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty clearly. So he is responding to moments here. This is in a conference about the establishment of the metaphysics of the world picture. This is a conference he's giving this paper at. Yeah. Yeah. So this is part of an invitation that's going on. This was delivered in Freiburg, right? Yeah. Right. In 1938, at a conference on the establishment of the metaphysics of the world picture. How did we get to think this way? You know, how did this result, to put it in Hegelian terms, how does the outcome or the result happen this way? Yeah. So anybody else, and I'll close out, let everybody go about their evening. I don't know. But Jocelyn, you're in the West Coast, or you're in a different time zone?
No, East Coast.
Oh, you're on the East Coast. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you're 9:32. Okay.
9:32. Yeah.
Yeah. And Carl, you're 6:30 in San Francisco?
Yeah, yeah, 6:30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay. And Jeff, you're 6:32 or 7:30 or
6:30.
6:30?
Yeah.
Okay. So you guys have ample time for early American dinners, huh? We Greeks
right.
eat very late. You know, we eat
Yeah.
at 10, 11. You know, we're yeah. So good. Okay. So yeah, see you next week.
Cool.
Thank you,
Okay.
everybody. And yeah, we'll take it up from here. Tonight was good in terms of
Thank
questions
you.
to address.
Yeah.